And then looking in the mirror, it started to glow. It started to give off a white light. And I just knew right away what that meant. It meant that I was a reincarnation of Buddha.
Cannabis truly is a pharmacy in a flower.
Survival comes with cooperation.
Pleasure is healing.
You're being a warrior of the weird.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. One person's religious epiphany is another's psychotic break. But Dr. David Lukoff knows we need to be careful about making distinctions. He asks, what if a psychotic experience holds truth? What if it's something you can learn from, which enriches your world once you come out the other side? From that perspective, therapists who work with patients experiencing schizophrenic or bipolar symptoms should probably have some appreciation for religious and spiritual experiences, so they can help integrate them without invalidating or disregarding these vivid experiences that might feel so meaningful. In the DSM, often called the Bible of psychiatry, Dr. Lukoff co-authored the category on religious or spiritual problems. As you'll hear, he was drawn to this work after his own long, life-changing experience. These psycho-religious problems include loss or questioning of a firmly held faith, conversion to a new faith, as well as near-death and mystical experiences. How do we integrate these into our lives when so many professionals have a slight disdain for anything with a whiff of religion to it? It's a tough game to play, but Dr. Lukoff has spent decades teaching and writing to help expand the minds of therapists and mental health practitioners. So if you want to hear a powerful story about what it's like to believe that you're the reincarnation of Christ, or you'd like to hear from a sympathetic professional who gives his patients the space and the tools they need to better understand their experiences, then you'll enjoy this conversation with Dr. David Lukoff. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. David Lukoff. Thanks for joining us.
Look forward to it.
And so I wanted to ask first, you mentioned about a psychedelic experience and how psychedelics haven't been central to your work, but they're central in you getting into your work. So I was wondering if you could share about how that happened.
Well, the origin story is a psychedelic experience that was both a spiritual awakening in my life and triggered a 2-month-long psychotic-like episode that I have had the opportunity to talk about, and I've even made a video on YouTube about my spiritual crisis to kind of, demonstrate what these experiences of crises are like and how they can be coped with and then ultimately integrated. So, yeah, I've been in academia about 40 years. I just retired a couple of years ago, and my career has really focused very broadly on spirituality. And I was involved in getting a diagnostic category for religious and spiritual problems. And now much of my work is focused on spiritual competency. And I'd love to say more about that later. But it was all triggered by my first LSD experience. And I was, at that point, 23 years old, had never done a psychedelic drug, and had gone through a very personal crisis of where I dropped out of Harvard graduate school. I had just gotten my master's degree in anthropology and was about to launch into my dissertation and all that rigmarole. And I just had this insight, which was very true, that I didn't know shit about myself or what I really wanted in life. I was just climbing a ladder one step after another. I went right from high school to college, and in college, all my summers I worked in various labs and research centers, and then I went right from college to graduate school. And I had this kind of awakening, and I think starting to smoke marijuana had contributed to that because I started to become much more self-reflective. And I just precipitously dropped out of graduate school and got rid of everything I owned that wouldn't fit into a backpack and just started hitchhiking around the country and got up in Canada and into Mexico for a while, and ended up in San Francisco about 6 months after that, after I dropped out. And somebody offered me, I was just walking around Golden Gate Park, and somebody offered me a tab of LSD, just offered it, and I took it. And I didn't actually ingest it right then. I did know nothing about it, and there really wasn't much known about guiding and stuff like that back then, 71. I'm sure some people knew about it, but it wasn't part of the cultural zeitgeist. So, but I did wait until the next day, and I took it on an empty stomach and had just this, wonderful day of just, walking around Golden Gate Park, hugging trees, which was very, a first time experience in my life. Just, I saw these trees breathing, right? And they, I just came over to them and found myself doing that. And then I went to the ocean, which is right there by Golden Gate Park, and just sat on the beach in this, state of just connection with the water and the waves were in me and I was in the waves, and just, thoughts I'd never experienced before. And that night I thought, well, that, was an interesting experience. I might want to do it again sometime, but I didn't really, it wasn't earth shaking. It didn't change my life or anything. That's what I thought. But then, and it's interesting, it wasn't right away, but 4 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night. I'd certainly been thinking about the experience on and off a little bit here and there, but I woke up in the middle of the night and just went into the bathroom of the place I was crashing at and looked at myself in the mirror. And all of a sudden, I started to hold my fingers in this mudra position of your thumb and your first forefinger holding together. I didn't know it was a mudra, of course, at that point. And then looking in the mirror, it started to glow. It started to give off a white light. And I just knew right away what that meant. It meant that I was a reincarnation of Buddha. And then had this additional insight that I was a reincarnation of Christ. And that my new mission was to create a universal religion. One for, Buddha had been for the East. That's how naive I was back then to think that he was the Eastern religion, Buddhism, and Christianity was the Western religion, even though I'd been raised Jewish, not very religiously, but raised that way. And somehow or other, I got this idea that was the West and the East, and I was bringing them together. And I sat down right then and there, pulled out the notebook I'd been carrying around in my backpack, a journal, really, and I just started to write my holy book. And I actually used the last funds I had to get it typed and printed, 40 copies of it, and I started to hand it out to people on the streets and stuff like that. And I thought once I had distributed the 40 copies, and I sent some to friends and stuff, then, that new holy book would be out there, and I can just wait, and people would ultimately recognize that I was, I don't know if I use the word Messiah, but a representative of that religion or the founder of that religion or whatever. And so that in a way was a blessing, because as crazy as that was, it meant that I didn't go talking about being Buddha and Christ. So I didn't get into any trouble. And I had friends that for 2 months just let me crash with them and fed me. And it was, enabled me to have a classic inner journey, as Joseph Campbell would call it. He did compare the hero's journey to the schizophrenic journey as both being inner journeys ultimately. And, my never having been hospitalized or medicated, I got to go through it for 2 months and land on the other end of it without any medication or anything. So I know that that's possible, and that has been something I've worked with in my career, is giving more permission for people to work through these kinds of crises on their own with support, but without medication and hospitalization and all that rigmarole. So at the end of that, when I kind of had both feet back on the ground, I was left with this question of what the hell just happened. How did this Jewish boy think he was a reincarnation of Buddha and Christ? And I had at that point in my life had no knowledge or interest in religion. I would have easily just said I was an atheist and not very interested in talking about it much because it just didn't seem rational. Well, I immediately started to wonder about what these religions were about. I'd never read the Bible, and I'd never meditated, and stuff like that. So the next 5 years of my life, together with being in Jungian analysis, I started to explore these things. And that led me into graduate school, and in graduate school in psychology, my career, starting with my dissertation, has focused on various aspects of spirituality. So my doctoral dissertation was a holistic health program for people diagnosed with schizophrenia. So it was exercise. I got them all running shoes. Found a way to get money to get all these patients running shoes, and taught them meditation and yoga, and had them express what they had experienced, the visions, the hallucinations, in art, and talked about, shamanic initiatory crises and what they were like, and did they have any similar experiences? And of course, many of them did. And so I gave them another perspective on their psychotic experience and so on. So I did that for about 3 years as a psychologist at Camarillo State Hospital. And ultimately spent about 20 years of my career focused on spiritual crises. And as I mentioned, I got this category. I was co-author of a category in the DSM on religious and spiritual problems and so on. Now, interestingly, when that happened, when it got accepted into the DSM, I was interviewed on NPR. The New York Times ran an article on it. All the psychology and psychiatry newsletters had little articles on it, and it really got out. And I started to get requests from county mental health centers, the California Department of Mental Health, Kaiser Permanente, to give workshops on spirituality. What is this, new thing that's happening where psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers are talking about spirituality? That was a total no-no in graduate training in the days that I went to school. You never talked about religion or spirituality. If a client wanted to talk about that stuff, you were told to refer them to a religious professional because you weren't competent to talk about religion and spirituality with clients. And absolutely true. You weren't competent because you weren't trained in it. But I started this process of training mental health professionals in spiritual competency. And that's evolved, and I've developed an instrument, an assessment instrument, and I have an online course I developed on it and have taught it dozens. I've given it many workshops, 15 different counties I've taught it here in California. And now I'm moving it online so it can be shared even more widely. But that's been my focus is, even if I was asked to, usually, when I was asked to give these workshops, they didn't really know what to even ask me to give talks on. And some places did specifically ask me to talk about spiritual crises because that was what I had written a dozen or 20 articles on or whatever and so on. And even then, when I was giving a presentation on spiritual crises, I would include the broader issues around spirituality because, 99% of clients are not in the midst of a spiritual crisis, but they may have spiritual questions. They may want to explore spiritual practices like meditation. They may, be having a crisis of faith. They've always been religious and now all of a sudden that doesn't mean anything to them, or they had an LSD trip they want to explore. So, I, in my role as a teacher, educator, although, I've given workshops at Esalen specifically all focused on spiritual crises. When I do my work in the mainstream of mental health, I always try to be much broader. And in fact, that's how I do view my role, my mission, or whatever, is to have one foot in this alternative world of spirituality, psychedelics, even, and the other foot in mainstream kind of mental health. I'm a licensed psychologist. I keep my license up. I've been very active in the American Psychological Association. I provide continuing education credits for a wide range of programs. I've jumped through all the hoops to become an accredited provider of American Psychological Association CE, so I can sponsor programs for continuing education like I do with MAPS for psychologists and social workers so they can learn about psychedelics and get CE credit. And I do that with places like Spirit Rock, so people can take mindfulness programs and get CE credit. And that's another, way that I try to get this work out is by both offering workshops and accrediting workshops at places like, Stanford's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, CCARE. They have compassion training courses. And I've worked out a way with them to get CE credits awarded for those. So, that's otherwise very difficult to get. Most people would not extend CE credit for those kinds of programs, but I've been willing to do that. So, to circle back, I guess that, it was this spiritual awakening triggered by psychedelics that got me going, but then I've kind of expanded more broadly into this domain of spiritual competency.
I'm very intrigued by you keeping 2 feet in both worlds like that because it's such an important part. It's so easy to speak to the choir. And you've written about the religiosity gap that mental health professionals often have where they'll ignore or pathologize religious or spiritual dimensions of life. And you're coming at it from a spot where you've experienced something like this. And I wonder how it's been talking to professionals who might not have ever had this kind of experience. And I've been reading Dr. Jeffrey Kripal's books about this, and he says how hard it is for people to get it. If you haven't had one of these crazy experiences, it can be outside your mindset of even how it could happen. So what's it like talking to therapists about this who might be more on the straight-laced path and haven't experienced this themselves?
Well, even if they haven't experienced a crisis, many of them would still say that spirituality is a major source of strength in their life. And yet, as therapists, they've been, it's been verboten for them to talk with clients about it. That's really been the standard perspective in mental health. And I think this has shifted, and I'll give 2 reference points on that. After the DSM category was accepted, I was invited to give a grand rounds lecture at UCSF, and they have them at Langley Porter, I think was the sponsor of it, and they happen every Friday. Every Friday they have somebody, usually a guest, not somebody on their faculty, but if somebody on their faculty just had a publication, they might ask them to give a talk on it. So a lot of people just every Friday take their brown bag lunch into this auditorium and listen to the grand round lecture. So I was being introduced, that day. It was like around 1995, I think. And now this is my memory. About a quarter of the people in that audience got up, grabbed their lunch, and walked out. They had no interest in listening to a lecture on spirituality. But when I give presentations now in public health kind of settings, county mental health departments and so on, I would say about 80% of the people walk in there with a huge smile on their face because they're finally going to get to talk about something that's important to them, their spirituality. And they know that the focus is going to be, how do you integrate spirituality into treatment? And many of them want to do it, but haven't a clue how you do that ethically. So I really think there's been a shift in that. Now, I'd say there's still a good 20% who, are there because it's a required part of the training. And some of them do sit there and are, clearly, they're not even trying to hide it, playing games on their iPhone. Just to show that they're atheists who think this is bullshit. But, even though a lot of psychologists are not religious, and they aren't members of churches, much lower percentage of psychologists, that's the religiosity gap you mentioned, are not involved in it. But many of them do self-define themselves as spiritual. And they do, if they're a seasoned therapist, once you've been working with people for a few years, you know how, important that is, what an important role that plays in most people's lives. Not all, but, and, they would not have been trained in how to access those strengths either. So I present a view to these people of, well, it's important to find out what their religious and spiritual strengths are. Do they pray? Do they meditate? Do they have any other practices? Do they do yoga? Do they garden? What gives their lives meaning? And then, if do they have any unmet spiritual needs? Do they have any conflicts around, a religious experience, or, they maybe have a life-threatening illness, or a loved one has a life-threatening illness, which raises a lot of religious and spiritual questions for people that they are often interested in talking about. So I think the religiosity gap is still there, but it's a lot of people now are very open to using the terminology more of spirituality. And that's been, by the way, in the research, the group that has just been expanding dramatically are people who are spiritual but not religious. Millennials, something like 70% self-define themselves as spiritual but not religious. And in the general population now, it's just in the last 15 years, it's gone from like 10, 11% to about a quarter of the U.S. population. So these are all things that I think are enabling mental health professionals, not only I would say enabling, but mandating that they cover religious and spiritual areas with their clients.
All of us mammals share an endocannabinoid system. That's why you hear so many stories of people using CBD-rich hemp extracts for their pets. It works for dogs, it works for cats, it works for all of us. For the Plus CBD line of pet products, we only made a few tweaks between what we give to us humans and what we give to our animal friends. It's still full-spectrum hemp extract with all of the rich fatty acids, terpenes, and minor cannabinoids that help the CBD to work better. It's still made with the highest quality to produce the most reliable hemp extracts on Earth. The only difference is that we adjusted the flavor palette to make it easier to give to your dog or to your cat. With flavors like chicken, beef, peanut butter, and salmon, it's easy to drop it into their food and allow them to enjoy the healthful benefits of CBD. Try Plus CBD's pet products today by using the coupon code LEXFILES at pluscbd.com for 25% off. Give your pets the gift of health. That's LEXFILES at pluscbd.com. And that makes sense that your work on the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 on religious and spiritual problems would help with that. And just for people listening, the DSM is the you could call the Bible of the therapist world. This is where you have your categories of problems, and it's also seen as a controversial work by some people as well, that it's too categorized. And so I was wondering if you had any comments on what it was like to be writing for the DSM, and when you did, how would you help the people reading it to differentiate between a spiritual emergence experience and schizophrenia, and how much those are intertwined?
I do think there are times where those are issues. Is it schizophrenia or is this a spiritual crisis? And there's also, and this has been a big part of my work with the consumer movement, there are many experiences that overlap. And the spiritual emergency movement was really very focused initially on, categorizing things as, oh, this is a psychotic episode. Even Stan Groff would say things like this. So therefore, the person needs medication, and it isn't a spiritual emergency. And he proposed criteria. I proposed criteria to differentiate them, and we can talk about that. But I think a very important area that got ignored by the Spiritual Emergency Network and that I've been involved with is the consumer movement. And these people, it's kind of, I'll tell you the story of how that connection was made, and that is because I published a couple of articles 20 years after that experience. I was emboldened. I started to share it in things like some classes I would teach. I don't know if I shared it in any of my public lectures, but I started to get comfortable sharing it with students and people that, I built up a relationship with, and so on. And then I wrote an article for Shaman's Drum, and ultimately I've written longer versions of it for Journal of Humanistic Psychology, and then a chapter in a book. And then, as I mentioned, I have a YouTube video on it too. So I started to be more public about it, and the consumer movement has really been promulgated by conferences. They've organized several conferences starting in the 90s where consumers either met by themselves and invited, some of them were themselves mental health professionals, but then they also started to have conferences together with mental health professionals with U.S. NIH funding. And I got invited to one of them to talk specifically about, spiritual emergencies within psychosis. And I started, at that point, I got interested in that and ultimately wrote a couple of case studies illustrating that, about how in a psychotic episode, you can still be traversing the same territory as a spiritual emergency, with, initiation episodes, descent into the underworld and all these things that are very ripe for therapeutic exploration, even if the person was having a manic episode or an episode of PTSD or anything else. If they were having these altered state experiences, they were still valid experiences. And the person might need protection in the form of hospitalization if they were dangerous to themselves, or just, unlike me, who had friends taking care of them, feeding me and stuff. I didn't need babysitting or around-the-clock care, but, I was just assuming I didn't need to pay for my own food. I was just waiting to be, on this mission. And other people in that same situation can end up, on the streets, and it's sometimes better if they get hospitalized so they don't get raped and beaten up and so on. So, but in those situations, there still is room for exploration of their experiences. And I twice organized groups focused on enabling patients to share their experiences of, talking to God or being Mother Mary or whatever these things. I organized one group like that at Camarillo State Hospital together with the chaplain at the hospital, who was actually a rabbi. And he and I led this group together. And then when I was a psychologist at the San Francisco VA Medical Center, I organized a group around religious experiences. It was actually called Finding Your Higher Power, and I did that together with a Lutheran. The VA chaplain was a Lutheran minister. So I think that's been a very important part of my work over the last 20 years, is with the consumer movement reclaiming the validity of these experiences that many of them have. The research shows that about 40% of people with schizophrenia and bipolar and so on have profound religious and spiritual experiences. And that those experiences, if they're really probed and explored, can often facilitate somebody's recovery. Certainly, if that's been finally recognized in the substance abuse treatment area, that spirituality and spiritual experiences play a central role in recovery, and I think they do in other mental problems.
And I've only learned of the mental health consumer movement in the last couple of years. I was wondering if you could just give a thumbnail sketch of its ideals and maybe share, if people are intrigued by those, how they could get involved.
I think really you'd have to trace it back to the civil rights movement. That was the first real movement of people saying, we're being mistreated, we have rights, et cetera, et cetera. And it led to the women's liberation movement. And I think some of that spun off into the consumer movement, which started here in the Bay Area. This was the home of much of its origins, not exclusively, but definitely the first consumer self-support groups focused on spirituality were held here in San Francisco. And I'm blocking on Jay Mahler. Was the kind of pioneer of that. And he was one of the people who ultimately, starting from just leading little groups in San Francisco, he was one of the movers and shakers who got funding from NIH and other places to really make it a mainstream movement of consumers. And they still have, they've actually gotten to the point now where many mental health departments hire ex-patients as they have peer counselors. So certainly peer counseling is one thing. If you Google, I think will bring you into some of this area, because these are consumers. I'm not sure that's the term I like the best, but it is the term that is used. In the UK, they talk about service users and so on. But anyway, these are the consumer movement overlaps with this peer support movement. On Facebook, there's a very active group. Let's see if I can recover the name of that. I'm blocking on it, but there are a number of people there who have created a Facebook presence where they support each other online, and I've looked at it and so on. I'm not involved with it. I just know it exists, and there literally are thousands of people who make use of it to support each other. So it's a very vibrant movement, and there are some groups that are kind of modeled after the 12-step approach. and they have you'd have to Google a little to get a name for that. But for people who just want to get together and talk about their spiritual experiences in a very supportive, structured way, they have created these 12-step model type programs for them.
That sounds fascinating. Thank you for sharing. We'll put some of those links into the episode notes.
Okay.
The other question, since we were talking about sources, my wife's a therapist, so she actually came up with this question. But who did you look to intellectually when you were first starting to study spiritual emergence? I know you've mentioned Stan Groff and Joseph Campbell, but were there other figures who were helpful in you in figuring out where you came to today?
Well, I didn't start with them. I started with Joseph Campbell and Jung, because at first I was so puzzled by this outrageous experience, that I was, embarrassed to talk about and so on. But I found it reassuring when I was reading Joseph Campbell in his Hero with a Thousand Faces. I could see parallels to my own experiences. And that was very helpful. And then I read another guy named Richard Buck, and his book, which, I'd been using this term and I didn't know where it came from. His book is called Cosmic Consciousness. And he wrote it, 120 years ago. I think it was like 1901 or something. And that was part of his point too, was he had all these people's experience. I think he started with Jesus, and I can't remember if Buddha was in there, but a lot of religious leaders. And then Walt Whitman had a similar kind of experience, and he documented that. And then, not surprisingly, he ended with his own experience, which was also, overlapped with my own in some ways. So, I first set out just looking for parallels. And as I mentioned, I did go into Jungian analysis a few years after that, and really did some more in-depth exploration of that. And then it was, I think about when I started my internship at Camarillo State Hospital, that's the first time I started to meet a lot of people who had experiences like my own. And I realized I was kind of, had intended to go into psychology more into kind of holistic health for, people experiencing medical issues, because I myself had a condition called Crohn's disease, and I've had several surgeries for it. And I got into holistic health, and it really made a big difference in my health and well-being. So I had kind of thought I'd learn a lot about holistic health, and my career plan was initially in psychology to have a holistic health-oriented private practice, and maybe even have a little restaurant or health food store associated with it to promote healthy eating, which is still a big issue for me. Because I do still work a little bit in this holistic health area. But when I got to Camarillo Hospital and I all of a sudden started to encounter people having these experiences, I kind of realized that my experience gave me a connection with people having psychotic experiences, psychotic disorders, that I didn't see. I could see that none of my other interns, none of the other staff had a clue what was going on. But I felt totally comfortable talking with these people about their experiences, and I could see how they could really benefit from that. So all of a sudden I decided that, well, I should really, devote my career more to people who have had experiences like my own. And I did start by running this holistic health program for them, because they could benefit from that as well, which included exploring some of their own experiences. So that was what led me in that direction.
And I'm curious, because you were at places like Esalen, which is known for this kind of stuff. Did you, along the way, when you found other people are interested in this kind of work and wanted to join you on your journey and work with you, did they also tend to have these kind of experiences, and that was helped spur them into this kind of work, or sometimes was it just an interest?
It was a mixture, but over time I gravitated to the field of transpersonal psychology because, I kind of want an academic career of some sort, at least publishing things. I didn't know if I wanted to be a professor, which I ultimately did become, but, you know, I, I still wanted to find a way to talk about these experiences and ultimately write about them to a professional audience. And I didn't find that in my internship. And then ultimately with, this holistic health program that I did my dissertation on and published an article on, I got a faculty position at UCLA. And that turned out to be a dead end because none of those people wanted to talk about spirituality at all. And in fact, I had done this program I mentioned, holistic health program, which included mindfulness. And I tried to get a mindfulness group going at UCLA, and nobody would let me work with patients using mindfulness. They thought that was a religious practice, totally inappropriate for UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. So I spent a good 6 years there trying to knock down walls that I ultimately couldn't. And ultimately, I moved to San Francisco, became very involved with transpersonal psychology, started to publish articles in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, give talks at conferences, and so on. And those became my homies, transpersonal psychology people. Some of them had spiritual emergencies. Many of them had psychedelic experiences, so they could identify with intense altered state experiences. And ultimately, I also began to, my academic jobs were at places like the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, where I taught for 7 years, and Saybrook Institute, which I headed a program there on humanistic and transpersonal psychology. So I ultimately went from UCLA, where I wasn't getting any traction on my work, to the Bay Area, where I could teach about it, I could write about it, and even at the VA, I did teach mindfulness at the San Francisco VA. So, ultimately I found a very hospitable environment here in the Bay Area for this work, and that gave me the ability to leverage that into, mainstream settings like APA. I could take the work that I'd been doing at the VA and talk about it at, the American Psychological Association conferences and so on. So I could start, and I did actually head a transpersonal psychology interest group within APA, and became very active in the division of APA that focuses on humanistic and transpersonal psychology. So I give transpersonal psychology the credit. And then I also was co-president of ATP for 14 years. That stands for Association for Transpersonal Psychology. They published the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and they held conferences on transpersonal psychology. So, I remember Rick Doblin at those early 80s conferences. He would be presenting then. That was really preaching to the choir because he got a great audience at these ATP conferences. And then I think ultimately, as you know, or people probably generally who know Rick know that story, he then went on to get a degree at Harvard, doctorate, in order to have the credentials to be able to speak to the FDA and work with, researchers and so on to move psychedelic research ahead. So he kind of did that same journey that I did, going and getting a doctorate and doing research and so on to move the field ahead. In my case, it was spirituality. In his case, it was psychedelics. but he certainly has had one foot in each of those alternative worlds.
I don't think many of us know about the clinical research that's been done on spirituality and mental health. And could you share a little bit about what is known in the more traditional scientific method kind of studies about spirituality and mental health, and what's exciting in the field for you today?
Well, the exciting part is the explosion of research and interest in this area. And literally, I have a slide that I've used in many presentations showing the number of articles on religion and spirituality from the 80s through, I think my last statistic is like 2016. And it's just, a very steep uh, and, actually increasing curve of articles. And now we have journals on spirituality. The APA publishes a journal it's called Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. And then they have another journal on spirituality in clinical practice. And I've published several articles in both of them. So that really is showing a presence in the field for this kind of research. And I think another very important contributing factor to this has been the research on mindfulness, and now that's been matched by the research on yoga, and other fields like Tai Chi and Qigong have the beginning of an evidence base to support their use in mainstream mental health kind of services. So I think that's all, the fact that there are these practices that are helpful, and we could even put psychedelics in that. I think psychiatry has been, given an injection of steroids or something, because most psychiatrists, 50% of psychiatrists say they would not go into psychiatry again because they got kind of, boxed into this role of giving people meds that don't work or work very temporarily and then get people addicted to them and make them miserable with the side effects and so on. So most psychiatrists are not happy campers with what they can do, compared to like surgeons who actually cure people and help people and blah, blah, blah. And in other fields, much more higher success rate. But psychedelics have enabled psychiatrists now to have a tool that is genuinely helpful. And, I would put, I've made this point in my work in psychedelics, my writing in psychedelics. I don't do any actual research, but to argue that people should also be, if they're really, like say, and I've talked with the Mithoffers about this, their work with PTSD, where they've used MDMA. And I've suggested that they make a package, kind of like the work that's done with smoking cessation. They use, at Johns Hopkins, they use the conventional smoking cessation curriculum. They just enhance it with psychedelics. And so I've argued that, programs with PTSD should also use mindfulness or yoga or some movement mindfulness practice like Tai Chi combined with MDMA to give somebody a tool they can make use of on a daily basis if they have any kind of resurgence of symptoms. So, I see them all as synergistic, that we finally have tools in the field of mental health that are actually helpful.
That's great. And to end on something practical, for all of us listening, what would you most want people know about the importance of spirituality for our mental health? And if you had any practices that we could take home?
Well, in my course and in my presentations, I always start with the overlap historically of spirituality and healthcare. In the earliest days of humans living together in tribes as hunters and gatherers, there were shaman who dealt with all issues, conflicts in the community, medical illnesses, mental problems, disagreements, whatever they were. And that person was in a joint role as a healthcare provider and a spiritual teacher. And over time, we've separated those roles. Even the earliest hospitals were part of the churches, both in the West with Christianity, and Buddhists opened up their own hospitals. So initially they were all together, and then starting in the 1700s, starting with actually Napoleon, he first insisted that hospitals not be part of the church, and they be publicly, supported institutions. So, and it probably was useful because religion isn't a good overseer of research. They have their biases. So it was good for, 130, 40 years for them to separate. And I think now is the time for some reconciliation, some marital therapy to bring, spirituality and healthcare together. And I do think that's happening. And I do think a lot of it is because people themselves are more and more people are partaking of these practices like mindfulness. The research shows that the number of people meditating has tripled in the last 20 years. The number of people doing yoga has more than doubled in that same time. And the number of people doing Tai Chi and Qigong and those things, and taking psychedelic drugs also, has been growing. So I think that has provided the foundation for this kind of rapprochement to happen. So I wouldn't recommend any one practice. I went through a journey, and I think most of my friends have too, of, they take a yoga class, they take a vegetarian cooking class, they, maybe experiment with psychedelics, then they, maybe go and try something they haven't done, like fasting, vision quest, or, people put together many different experiences, and then over time they figure out what really works for them. So for me, even though I've done meditation retreats, and I'm actually in a group that meets once a week to meditate together, and we do some longer sessions. Once a quarter, we do a whole day together. But it's not my main practice. I like moving meditation practices. So I'm really into Tai Chi and Qigong, and I do that almost every day. But my wife does her yoga practice every morning. So, my suggestion is, to find your practice, find what works for you. And fortunately, we live in an era where all these world's practices are available. It is just an amazing time to be alive.
Amen. And I wanted to end with one last practical question about spiritual emergence and mental health. If someone had a friend who might have been in a state like you were during your experience, where it's different, and you're not quite sure what to do to help, how would you counsel us to take care of our friends if you see them going through something that might be a spiritual emergence, might be a schizophrenic episode? How would we support?
Yeah, that's where I do think some of the stuff from the spiritual emergency movement can really apply, because they really did focus on, people not after the episode, how to integrate it, but during the episode, how to help somebody through it. And I think it's a combination of things of, first of all, giving them, if they're really puzzled or upset by these experiences because they're so novel and different, to, show them parallels like I mentioned in my holistic health group. And now you can go on YouTube and find some of my videos, or other people's videos, of course, that will really walk people through the territory of these kinds of what do I want to say? Anomalous, non-ordinary. That's a term the Groffs used that I like, non-ordinary experiences. But then also a mistake that sometimes people make in the midst of these things is to really get very focused on it. So they stay up all night, Googling things or doing a practice like meditation because, that's their newly discovered favorite thing to do. And they get dehydrated, low blood sugar because they don't eat, or they do things that aren't taking care of themselves. And that's a role that you or a helper can play, is just making sure that they take them for walks and you make sure they get fed, healthy food and stuff. And I've been involved in a couple of times where we've done that for a friend, like for a couple of weeks. We've taken turns, spelling each other, spending time with that person to make sure they don't do anything dangerous, wander off into the woods or into the street, make sure they get food, make sure they get sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So really taking care of them that way, I think, helps.
Okay, that's great. Well, Doctor, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing how all of these paths led together to your work now. It was very interesting to hear about, and I appreciate it.
Well, good. Well, you're one of the people getting some of this good work out into the world, so it's an honor to be one of the people you asked to present.
Great. Thank you again, and I look forward to next time.
Okay, Lex, take care.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, check out pluscbdoil.com, listen on all the podcast platforms, or see us on YouTube. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code LEXFILES for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com, and please follow the podcast on Twitter @The Lex Files Show, where I try to keep it fun. If you enjoyed this program, please give us a like on your favorite platform or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. Thank you to Tina Molnar and Jasmine Morris for the visuals, and the music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.